Conservation of the fisheries of our oceans has proved to be a complex issue for our generation. While there are varying opinions on what to do to solve this problem, the one that you are likely to hear is a call for stricter regulation. So let's first analyze what happens when you regulate an item or service. On this visual aid, the green arrow in the middle represents regulation, while the yellow bubble at the top represents legal trade, and the purple bubble represents a black market. In the first stage, the introduction of a little regulation creates a small black market, while the majority of trade is still done through legal means. The reason the black market forms is because the good or service can be sold cheaper, perhaps because it dodges a tax or uses a non-legal means of acquiring the good or service. In the second stage, the regulation increases. The legal trade market is reduced, and its newly formed void, the black market, expands. The final stage is similar to a near ban on a substance, resulting in very little legal trade and an extremely large black market. So what does this emergence of a black market have to do with regulation? The reason it's important is because as regulation becomes tougher and tougher, for the regulation to be effective, it must spend an exponential amount of money to combat the growing black market. To better understand this phenomenon, ask yourself these questions. Are regulated substances such as drugs still available within the US? Even though over $1 trillion has been spent in order to prevent drugs from being available in the US, one can easily acquire any drug they desire in any city. What about illegal immigration? Has the regulation of human behavior been effective? Has the number of illegal immigrants decreased because a politician in Washington, D.C. said you cannot do that? The point I'm trying to drive home is that just because you regulate something doesn't mean that it will actually be effective. I also hope that the enormous cost of regulation does not also mean that it will be effective as well. More specific examples regarding animals where regulation was not as effective as intended were the Bengal tiger for their body parts, rhinos for their horns, although some places have had success by giving local tribes ownership of the rhinos, and even fish such as tuna are also regulated by state governments as well, although not strictly enforced. It should be noted, however, that not all regulations have adhered to the extent of the emergence of a large black market, such as the example I gave earlier. These programs have been much more effective. One such program is the regulation regarding whaling. A personal opinion of mine as to why this regulation has been much more successful is due to their sheer size that makes it rather difficult to sneak them into port. Also, a rather large vessel would be needed, lessening the number of possible pirates that could harvest the whales. Shark finning is regulated in the Caribbean. However, it has not had this fortune of size to protect it from illegal fishing. So, if regulation is not able to save the fisheries, what could? To propose my own possible solution, please watch this well-explained illustration of the tragedy of the commons so that you can understand why fisheries are becoming depleted.
The tragedy of the commons. It's a tragedy because nasty things happen when everyone owns something. I first heard that phrase in a story about some shepherds who lived around a grassy area they called a commons. Since all the shepherds shared this free green grass, they grabbed as much of it as possible. They kept breeding sheep and bringing many more sheep to graze, but soon all the grass was gone. The sheep died, and the shepherds had nothing. So then they divided the commons into parcels. Now each shepherd owned one. Each had an incentive to limit the number of sheep that grazed on his grass. Prosperity happened, and everyone lived happily ever after.
Now that you understand the concept of the tragedy of the commons, ask yourself what would happen if the sheep could migrate around the 4 properties so that each shepherd would own them for a short period of time. Essentially, this would be the tragedy of the commons model for the ocean. But what would be the consequences of privatizing the ocean in such a manner? This is the model I would like to propose as an alternate solution to regulation. First, let's see how the plots of oceans would be divided. In this image, the 2 long parallel lines forming a street would be a shipping lane. This would still be a public location where international trading ships could traverse. However, all forms of fishing and dumping of waste would be prohibited. This narrow strip of ocean would be much better policed than the whole ocean due to its smaller size. The plots would be divided into extremely large parcels in contrast to smaller ones. I'll explain the reasoning for this in a moment. These additional green areas would represent protected nurseries where even the ocean plot owners would not be allowed to fish, although these areas could be done privately or publicly. Also, military vessels and police forces would still have the rights to travel through private land provided they do not fish or dump in the area. So keeping in mind this is an oversimplified model of how the privatized system would look, what would be the possible consequences if this were implemented? The knee-jerk reaction would be that the initial buyers of the plots would exhaust the fisheries by extracting as much fish as possible. However, remember when I said the plots would be rather large in size. The purpose of this would be to increase the initial bidding price of the plot to entice the owners not to overfish their plots, because if they do so, the profit they gain from an overharvest would be offset in the loss of value of the plot they purchased. Another possible scenario could play out similar to the OPEC nations' control over oil. Instead of oil, owners of plots that have fish that migrate between each other would sign a contract with each other, promising that they will only harvest a set number of fish of a particular species in order to assure that the fish will return the following year, maximizing profit from the ocean plot. This would likely result in a more sustainable supply of fish, which would be likely a smaller amount than current supply, pushing the price of the fish up for the ocean plot owners. This increase in price, along with less supply, would incentivize pirates to fish illegally on privately owned plots. But remember that the ocean plot owners are seeking a profit, so they have every reason to effectively police their own property to ensure this doesn't happen. Of course, the possibility that a private system for the ocean could fail should not be ignored as well. The truth is no one truly knows what the consequences would be if the system were to be introduced. I personally feel that a system where individuals have a direct incentive, as with personal property in contrast, will have a higher chance in regards to conserving fisheries compared to harsh regulation. However, during a time when the federal government has a total of negative $16.5 trillion to apply to this problem, if you still feel that our responsible politicians will regulate U.S. fisheries properly, I have a parting gift just for you.
But we have to pass the bill so that you can find out what is in it.
I want to kill everybody in the world.